There
Okay,
you go.
recording is
Are
ready.
we ready? Okay. So our guest is Tom Manshreck, and I'll give you the brief version of the introduction. He's and maybe if you want to expand on this more, Tom, but according to our bio, you're a technical writer in software engineering at Google since 2005 and the author of the O'Reilly book, Software Engineering at Google. Do you want to add to that?
I do have extensive experience in the Bay Area. So I did, after graduation, work at a company called GeoWorks, which I'm not sure many of you might have heard of, but maybe some of you did. Most of those people ended up actually at Google. So I'm pretty familiar with technical writing. There was no technical writing program when I graduated, really. I think UW might have had the first one, if I remember correctly. And now, of course, there are programs. So I kind of fell into the role accidentally, which is probably not unique in the group this large. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good introduction. I mean, 14, 15 years at Google is a very long time, as you probably know, in the internet age. So it has changed a lot. And that was important for me in writing the book. I saw a lot of stuff and I kind of wanted to get it down.
Okay. I sort of have a list, and I'm just going to start at the top. Sure. And sort of fire off questions. And then I'm sure we'll find out what direction this goes in. But maybe you could start by telling us about this book and how it came about and how you became involved.
Sure. So it's kind of a confluence of two things. In fact, one of your members here, Larry Hoskin, actually used to work at Google, and I used to work with him. When I joined Google, I joined as a software engineering, a programming technical writer. I knew how to program, and I had experience writing technical documentation. And I ended up creating at Google developer guides for internal engineers. And at the time, I thought, like, hey, it would be great to make,
I didn't understand.
Oh, see, if I talk about my namesake, I'll have to unplug my Google Assistant. And at the time, I said, hey, wouldn't it be great to create an O'Reilly book of all engineering practices? Because no one knows how to write this stuff. And Eric Schmidt, I remember at the time, said, no, what happens if we leave that at the Starbucks? People will, we were a different company back then. But the germ of this came about because I've worked on the C++ team as a technical writer for about 10 years now. And my boss, who is Titus Winters, is also on the book. He came up with the idea that, like, he approached me and he said, hey, what do you think about writing a book? And the reason is that before I joined Google, I actually was a managing editor at Prentice Hall in computer science. So I had a leg up. I knew the process of what it took to make a book. It was the academic market, not the professional market, and there's some differences there. But I knew it was a lot of work. And I said, like, okay, are you sure you want to do this? Because it's going to be twice as much work as your worst case scenario. And he said, sure. But his main theme was and this is something that I kind of developed too. When we program, we tend to think in the here and now, and we don't think about what happens once we write stuff and then we have to maintain it. Our industry is young. And as a result, we wanted to treat something that was different than programming. And the germ of it was, the thesis was, engineering is different than programming, and engineering is programming integrated over time. So with that kind of germ, I kind of went and thought about it and came up with some basic rough theses for what we might want to cover in a book. And then I came back to it. But that's pretty much how it started, and the reason I brought up the whole thing about Eric Schmidt was that, it's always been, for 14 years, I've been thinking of something along these lines. I just never thought I would publish it as an external book. I thought I would publish it as a series of internal documentation for engineers.
Right. And you had this role called curator in the book. I was curious as to how that title came to be and what it entails, and how is it different from an editor? Does that just mean that they already have an editor at O'Reilly, or?
Well, so one thing that was different about, so we already had a book that we kind of wanted to base this on. There's a book called the Site Reliability Engineering book, and I'm not sure any of you are familiar with it. But that was a book that was edited by a number of authors. But the difference with that book was that was a collection of essays, basically. It did not have a theme. It did not have a progression. It was just 30 or 40 different chapters, and the editors themselves solicited them, and then they edited them. So it was so when they say edited by, they really meant edited by. But in our case, we wanted, I mean, the three authors that are curated on the top wrote about 7 or 8 chapters in the book. But we also didn't want to say we wrote it because we have a bunch of volunteers. We didn't want to offend them. But we also didn't want to say edited by to make it seem that we were not the driving force behind it either. So we kind of came up with curated as a compromise. O'Reilly suggested that, and I couldn't come up with anything else that was better, other than listing everyone who wrote a chapter on the front of the book, but that would have got too long.
Right. So it is kind of a hybrid role.
It was a hybrid role, and since I'm talking to technical writers, not engineers, the editorial process was extensive. I basically was a developmental editor for the entire book. Then I was also a copy editor for a series of chapters. I was the proofer for the book. But the editing was very extensive. It wasn't just a passive editing. I would meet with most of the authors once a week for a period from 6 months to a year, and we'd go over the drafts and go over ideas, and then so it was a very involved process. And I'm also lucky that I had 2 other editors. As you know, I think on the individual chapters we have the authors credited and the editors. So I did have I don't know if you're familiar, Rena McNamara. She's fairly well known in the technical writing community. I was glad to have her involved, and Lisa Carey, who I work with a lot and love her work, and she's in Ireland. So I got them to basically help me out, because otherwise it would have just been too monumental at the copy editing level. I would have just been sitting here copy editing for probably still copy editing if I had to do it myself.
I imagine that was really familiar, considering that you were an editor at a publishing house before. So were you playing a much larger role in terms of developmental editing and so forth than the other curators? Were you sort of carrying a lot of the weight?
And I don't know how many other people have worked with O'Reilly before, but there are good and bad points to working with O'Reilly. The good point is that they're very cooperative, and they kind of leave you alone. The bad point is they aren't going to help you that much. And I don't really mean that in a bad way, but they're more like, hey, this is great. If you give them a bad chapter, they'll say, hey, this is a bad chapter, can you rewrite it? But they won't really like do that sort of deep dive that you might expect from another publishing house. Because I had done this in the past, I mean, the overall effort is the book itself. I'm proud of the book, but I'm kind of happiest with the quality of the chapters of editing them. I had a lot of fun working with the engineers on this. It was a pretty good year well spent interacting with engineers, but it was a lot of work.
Very interesting. What can you tell us more about that process? Did it come out? I was going to ask you if it came out different from the way you expected. So I don't know if your expectations would have been really far off, having so much experience, but then again, this is kind of a different project. So were there any surprises?
Yeah, what's funny is I gave a talk like this very similarly to Google, but I gave it to engineers. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, I was going to talk about, the architecture of the book and the thought process and the philosophy. They really wanted to know how the book was actually printed. They were kind of curious about all that stuff. I assume a lot of people aren't interested in that particular part. Maybe. But maybe. but yeah, it did change a lot. And I mean, when you're writing a book, it's going to change. The original idea you have is going to change. I will say we had a pretty clear, I had that theme, which I mentioned, which was programming integrated over time. And which Titus developed, and that we basically what I came back to is I kind of went into like into my caveman cave and tried to come up with themes that each chapter should touch upon. And after a couple of weeks of that, I came up with the three themes of time, scale, and cost, basically. And what I meant by that was that, like, when engineers are writing stuff, you know, there's the positive spin and then there's the negative spin. I've seen how the sausage is made, so to speak, at engineering, and I think a lot of us have. And sometimes we're frustrated, and we find out what works and what doesn't work. And what I found that doesn't work is when people write code, but they don't plan for it to live longer than the time that they write it. You know, they don't put enough tests on it that will detect when something breaks, et cetera. The other thing that Google had a unique perspective on was just so massive. So something that you might, you know, I joined in 2005 when there were maybe like 2,000 employees, and there's some of that code still living. But how does it work now that it's deployed on, you know, 100,000 machines, et cetera, you know? So the question of how something scales is very important to an engineer. And then the last was cost. And I don't mean cost as really so much as like money and resources, although that's certainly part of it. I meant the stuff like opportunity cost and just the amount of labor that it would take to manage a project. And that's something that Google obviously it has a unique experience because we're profitable. We're very profitable, so we don't have some of the constraints that like a startup would have, for example. A startup cannot ignore those questions of cost. And they might sacrifice stuff on time and scale because they just need to get something out the door. I think anyone who has deployed on cloud or in a cloud like Amazon or AWS or something like that is probably familiar. It was just something out the door and then it becomes successful and then suddenly they have to rewrite their code so that they can maintain it. And it's a laborious process. So what I really wanted to cover is like, here are the things that you should think about if you're successful, if the code you write lives for 5-10 years, if it's deployed on 100,000 machines, that sort of stuff. And once I came back with that, the gist of the book came together. I was able to develop a table of contents, and I wanted to do this as a kind of like as a linear process in the book, and I hope I've succeeded to some degree. I didn't want to have a bunch of disparate topics. I wanted it to make sense. So I have the foundation and the culture and the team building aspects earlier in the book, and then more on processes and the more technical process get, including stuff like continuous integration, which is extremely important, and then the tooling. And Google has a bunch of really unique and cool tools, and I wanted to distill what was good about those things. So we had a pretty good TOC. Well, I got to say that once I wrote out that TOC and then I looked at it like a year and a half later, there were some things added and some things dropped, but it was pretty, you know, the table of contents and the abstract were set probably pretty early in the process.
That's interesting. You thought about the architecture first before anyone started writing a word.
Yeah, well, that's just what I do.
Yeah, I think everyone will realize the wisdom of that. When you gave guidance to the writers, how much structure was there? Was there like a template, or was it sort of like some here are 3 things that you should cover?
Yeah, excuse me, just got a little frog in my throat. Yeah, so you know, you're probably familiar with the concept of a postmortem. We did have a pretty good idea. So what I would do to folks is when we were trying to solicit people to write chapters, we were going out to people who we thought were either experts or could offer something. We were using word of mouth. We were asking people on the sly. We did not really kind of want to open it up to all of engineering because we didn't want to have to sift through 20 or 50 different competing chapters. Because something like this, people were, it was not hard to twist people to write chapters on this stuff. They were happy to do so. But I wanted to make sure that they really thought about it and wrote it well. That's, as I'm talking to technical writers here, and there are some great engineers that are writers, and then there's some great engineers that are not great writers. And so, I wanted to see if they were going to work within the abstract of the book, which is to address these particular themes. So we made one mistake, which was there were some obvious great people that we came to, and we just said, hey, can you write a chapter? And they said yes, and we said great. And we didn't make them write an abstract. We didn't make them go through this. This is a one-to-one relationship. It was amazing. Everyone that I made write an abstract based on those themes and iterate on, and by an abstract, I meant like 2 or 3 paragraphs about what the chapter was going to be about. Those chapters almost universally came out like slam dunks immediately. Anyone, no matter how intelligent or great that they were, who didn't write an abstract, those chapters needed a heck of a lot of work. So what I would ask, if anyone is going to do something like this and get collaborators, really guide them about what you want to get out of the chapters. Don't just give them a vague notion and have them write something. That's
very interesting. Now I'm scribbling notes because so is this okay? I wanted to hear more about lessons about helping engineers. That seems like a natural transition from where we are. The lessons you would have for people who need to help engineers write documentation.
Oh, so you want me to in specific address documentation here?
Yeah, exactly. Because we're all in that position sooner or later where and of course we're not doing a book for O'Reilly, but we might be helping engineers to get started to write something, but it will be like the documentation for the product. So right. Any thoughts on that, or just writing and helping engineers write in general, I guess would be.
Yeah, well, so, and this is some, I hope that most of you have actually read the documentation chapter. I'm actually kind of interested in what you all think about it, because in all honesty, I never went to a program. Most of this stuff I just kind of like ingested over my career, and it's just my thoughts. It seems to align with what a lot of other technical writers think, which is to like identify the audience, that sort of stuff. But I'm not sure. But that chapter was in specific not meant to be technical writing. It was not meant to be, if you're a technical writer, this is how you do it. It was directed purely at engineers. And the idea was to try to lower the intimidation level, and that's usually something that I do with engineers. A lot of mistakes that I see technical writers make is that they try to make engineers write like technical writers. I don't know if that makes sense. That's not their skill set. You can make sure that the grammar is correct. You can make sure that the clarity is there. But I tend to back off a bit based on that. I have very high standards for what I write and what I review from other writers. But I am not interested in talking about passive voice and stuff like that with engineers, as long as it's clear. If it's obviously incorrect, I will fix it. But I think part of the thing is just to not intimidate writers on the writing part of it. The whole point is to make them comfortable with what I always tell engineers is, like, they're always intimidated about writing. And I just tell them that you're just writing stuff, and I think I put that in the book. You're writing for your past self. You're documenting something that you didn't know what the heck it was. So talk to your past self before you knew all the stuff that you know now. And that tends to help out a bit with them. And of course, I still get engineers who are like, no, I really want to know how to write. And then I'll dive into some of the more esoteric things and my thoughts, which I think everybody here is mostly familiar with. But I think it's engaging the writers on the audience. That's probably the first thing. You really got to drill it into them that, like we were talking about APIs earlier, I think. This is something I found in my career at Google, is that engineers are very good at writing for their own team. If they have a domain knowledge, they can write for their own team. But when they create an API and they are starting to write for other developers who aren't familiar with this, they don't do very well there. And that's where technical writers, I think, have a lot to offer. They have a lot to offer in identifying that audience and writing to that particular audience. Like any sort of like cloud developer docs or API docs. Technical writers tend to do much better with those than engineers. Probably because they don't make all these assumptions. I usually introduce myself to a new engineering team and as somewhat of a useful idiot. I will pretend, I say, I don't know anything about your project. I'm going to ask you a lot of dumb questions. And I try to caution them and say, well, just to be clear, I'm not dumb, but I'm dumb right now. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. Once I get those questions answered, I'm going to give you something.
It's helpful. By the way, what do you think of templates? I know Google has templates. Do you find them useful for helping engineers be better at documentation?
I do. I'm not a huge template person. I tend to, we have a lot, I mean, Markdown, I think, has made the most strides in helping engineers write stuff. And providing simple templates, it's not the template so much that I find that's important. It's the raw skeleton of the organization of a doc set that I find important. So for example, any particular template on a conceptual doc or a tutorial, people can go back and forth on what that will look like and how it will behave. But to me, it's more important to provide a set to engineers saying, hey, you're launching a new product. These are the 5 docs you need. Okay. And here's the templates for them. So right. What I'm saying is that the organization is actually, to me, more important than any particular template, because templates seem to change, and some people disagree. But the organization tends to be the toughest part that engineers do. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I have seen so many product pages in engineering that are just one long page with a whole bunch of different stuff, and I'm like, that doesn't work. And it takes and if you can give engineers the different pigeonholes to put their documents,
okay,
then I can move off. Then I can say, hey, you're doing great, and then I move on to another project.
So it'd be more a case of getting all the reference over here in the reference document and all of the how-to stuff into this quick start. That sort of organizing. Okay.
And it's kind of like a bootstrap problem. So once you bootstrap it, it's people tend to know what to do with it. Not always.
Yeah. Very cool. I mean, once you give people the templates, though, doesn't it help to also have kind of a checklist in there of everything that should be in each of those documents?
Oh yeah, and that's where I say, like, the template to me can act as the template to me can act in some ways as the bad cop. You know, I can be the good cop technical writer, and I can give them the template, which is telling them what to do, and that will be the bad cop. But it also depends on exactly what they need. I tend to, like, for example, I have rules regarding tutorials. For me, if someone writes a tutorial, I don't want any links going anywhere else. You know, I don't want a bunch of implementation details and extraneous material. I want each step to be an intended action for whatever is meant to be the actioner, the action holder at that time, either the system or the user. If you're doing user docs. Engineers start to understand that, but it's hard to put that in a template, you know? So I can give them a template for a tutorial, but I'm gonna need to kind of review that and kind of give them advice that is a bit more technical writing on top of it. So that's why I'm saying I'm not quite sold on that templates are the be all and end all. A lot of groups are, and I don't have anything really against that. I'm just saying that's my personal opinion.
Right. Maybe like a good starting place, but you would still go further than that in helping people.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you'd want to convey as how to help engineers write documentation, or did you learn anything in the process of this book?
Yeah, well, I certainly learned a lot about the individual software practices. I mean, I had the table of contents, but there's a lot of really interesting, like in regards to how the build system works. I thought that was a great chapter. In regarding to testing doubles in particular, because I've seen the problems that arise when people misuse mocking systems. I learned a lot myself in the process. With the engineers, I think that what I was able to get them to agree with the book is that it was actually all right to actually give people advice and tell people what to do. This is might be specific to Google in general, but it's I'm certain a lot of other software companies are like, hey, all bets are off. Whatever way you want to do it is fine. And a lot of engineers were kind of reluctant to say, like, even though they had very strong opinions about certain things, they were reluctant to tell their colleagues, hey, you're going wrong here. I would do it this way. And that was that I had to work on in the book. The book had a lot of mights and mays and maybes and shoulds, and I was like, no, let's put it down here. Let's say, if you have something to say, be active and say what you have to say.
That kind of segues into the last question I have, which is, how about lessons that you would give to engineers? If you were talking to, I don't know if we have any developers here today, but we can all tell them the lessons. If you were speaking directly to the engineers, what would you impart to them normally?
Yeah, if I were giving an elevator pitch, I would just say, treat documentation like you treat code, by almost the exact same processes. I think many here, I've been a huge advocate from the very beginning for putting documentation under source control, for having it be reviewed, for including it alongside the code that it documents, which has gotten a lot easier. I think you might be familiar with G3doc, which I mentioned in the chapter, but I know Rena has talked about it at previous Write the Docs. G3doc was it's basically a markdown interpreter that's built into our code base. And we have code, and then we have G3doc directories, and G3 stands for Google 3, so it's Google 3 documentation. And anything that they would put in that directory, first of all, it was a security thing, so you wouldn't put in executables in there, so it could cause damage. But the most important thing is that it was documentation that sits alongside the code. This was like, it's very obvious to do to me, but it has so many wins, because the engineers basically start to treat the documentation like they treat any other thing under their code base. If something changes, if someone reports an error, if someone, all kinds of stuff. And they can look through the version history and find out when something did something wrong. That would be the elevator pitch, is to treat documentation like code. It's in general, it's probably the hugest win, the biggest single one thing that an engineer can do.
It sounds like that gets the engineers to sort of take ownership. Like if they're following up whenever they hear a bug, and whenever they hear that there's a bug or something like that, or maintaining.
Yep. And in fact, I mean, like, a lot of these things are documented in the book related to code. Code needs owners too. Code needs source control. Code needs code review. Code needs some sort of continuous integration system. That you don't really have for documentation yet. But I'm sure people have talked about, we have certain things where we have living code, for example. You check in living docs, you check in documentation, and you check in sample apps, and they get integrated into the documentation automatically. All of that stuff, there are analogs to whatever you do with code that you can do with documentation. What's funny is that when I came to Google, this was self-evident to me, and I had done it before. But Google in 2005, everything was on a wiki. And everyone in engineering had the same blanket ownership. And if you know anything about a commons, if everybody owns something, no one owns something. And that thing just became a complete mess. And I started arguing, oh, we got to put this stuff under source control. And you won't believe the amount of fighting that took. There were so many engineers who were like, what, you're making documentation harder to do? All that's going to lead is terrible documentation. But it doesn't. I would counter to them and say, like, well, we do code review. Do you want to just let people just check in code without reviewing it, without testing it? Eventually, I won out on that, and I think engineering. Once we got G3doc, it was like, oh, now I get it. You know, collectively, G3doc has been a huge success, and it certainly allowed most of the technical writers at Google to focus on other things rather than whatever fire drill happened to be going on in the latest year or two. Engineers can focus on their product documentation, and technical writers can focus on the more ecosystem documentation that's larger than that.
So having the tools made a big difference. Having the right tool.
Having the tools,
to get the engineers involved.
I do discuss Critique, which is our code review tool. I absolutely love that code review tool. That would be the single biggest tool loss I would have if I ever left Google. I have used GitHub, I've used a variety of different code review tools, and they're just nothing like Critique. It is a fantastic tool, especially for documentation. I will get reviews from engineers, and instead of replying back and forth, I can actually go in the review and edit and provide a suggested edit to what they have done. So that makes the code reviews go very fast. Because if they're sending something to me, they usually defer to me on matters of writing, and I can kind of touch things up. And then they might submit it, and then I might go back and do a more major edit while everything is now accurate. They can focus on accuracy, and I can focus on the actual writing.
This makes sense. I think we're almost ready to open this up and see if people have any questions, but is there anything that you wanted to talk about today, or that you should say that we haven't hit yet before we go that way?
I guess I can talk a little bit about the actual production of the book.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Which might be interesting to folks.
Yes.
The good thing here was that, I mean, some people do write books at Google. They usually write them in their own time. Google has policies on this. We didn't make any money of it, and we didn't want to. If you know anything about the publishing industry, you know you don't make a lot off technical books anyway. A technical book that sells 10,000 or 50,000 is probably it, except if you happen to write Kernighan and Ritchie or something like that. One of the long-lasting books. So don't write a technical book to make money. But the process was, if I had written this myself, it would have taken probably 1/3 the time. If I had written it with my two other authors, the primary curators, it probably would have taken half the time. I'm not regretting that, because we got so many different voices, but it's a lot of work to actually go through the editorial process. I've done this before at Prentice Hall, and what I would generally do, it wasn't done electronically back then. Everything was done, I would have one of those giant wall-mounted Post-its. They used to have these giant Post-its that are almost the size of a wall. And I would just draw grids on them and draw chapters and draw various columns for different states of the chapter. And I'd just be checking everything off until it finally got to the last row and then the last column, and then I could ship that thing off to a printer. And I did something similar for this book. I did use I used a Google spreadsheet, but I think the columns were like up to double D or something at the end of it. It was that many processes for each chapter, because there was soliciting an author, getting an abstract. The abstract was in various states, approving that, getting a first draft, doing some developmental editing. Each step along the way, I kept having to do a little bit more. And then I had to serialize it, because if I was doing this myself, I would just be sending chapters off to O'Reilly as they're done. but I didn't really want to do that for O'Reilly at the time. So what I did was I had the different editors that I involved in, and I kind of charted out the work. And then I would lie to people. I would tell 1/3 of the folks, hey, your chapter's due at this time, so make sure you're done. I would tell 1/3 of the other authors that their chapter was due 6 weeks later, and I would tell the other third that it was due like 3 months down the line, because that's the only way to manage it. Some of them got smart and go like, hey, why is mine due now and Doug's isn't due until July? And I'm like, because there's only one me. But basically I had to manage that like a printing process. And once I had gotten to that point, we did this in Google Docs, a variety of things. I had to do some like technical weird things with Google Docs. What I would do is I would end up, because these docs were usually shared with engineering, and a lot of people would comment. And not all of those comments would get resolved because it's impossible if so many people are commenting. But at some point I would make a copy, and then that thing would just continue to exist and people would be commenting, and I'd be like, sorry, you're past the deadline, I don't care. And then I would use that copy, and then I ended up making like 5 different copies for each chapter at various pages. And that was mostly to avoid the authors getting like feedback that probably would have been poor. I wanted to insulate them from not necessarily trolls, but people who are like, hey, why are you doing this? So I wanted to make sure it was done in an appropriate manner. But at the very end, what you end up with is you end up with a collection of chapters. They've been developmental edited, they've been copy edited. I would send those off to O'Reilly. O'Reilly would okay them and have some minor corrections, but mostly they were fine with them. And then they would make PDFs and proofs. And in the old days at Prentice Hall, I would get a box of like actual 150 DPI PDF proofs, and I would just, that are printed out, and I would just check mark each page that is correct. And if there was a page that wasn't correct, I would exit and say like, what do you got to fix? So I did the same thing equivalently with like Acrobat Reader in the PDF proofs. And then and that was kind of, there was also getting the VPs to approve it. So that was unique to Google because of legal issues. I needed to make sure that a VP approved it, and that meant a VP had to read the whole thing. And that's not a difficult thing to do, except that it's very difficult to get VPs time for anything. So I had to kind of like knock that upstairs for a while. It took about 6 weeks, but that's not bad.
That's pretty lucky. I was wondering if this all happened on the clock in your regular work week as a Google project. It wasn't outside of work, or?
It was not outside of work. So that's what I was lucky. And the reason is I reported to my boss, who this was his main project for about a year as well. I would say I worked on this about 8 months to a year of person time. I was probably working on it half time during that whole year and a half though.
Okay.
But certainly at the latter stages when I'm going through the editing and the proofs, that was almost my full-time job, and it frequently was my weekend work. I would be taking drafts down to the coffee shop and reviewing them and stuff like that.
Now that sounds enjoyable.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't mind it. The thing that got to me the most was reading the same chapter for the 6th time or something. That got a little tiring.
You're reading it backwards by then, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So I think we have some questions in the comments here.
Sure.
So I know, Chuck, do you still want to ask your question? It's okay to ask it out loud at this point.
I can do that. I was just curious, like, especially being at Google, Google being about search, and you talked about organization, you talked about structure and all this other kind of stuff. Isn't there an inherent idea that all anybody needs is search, so you really don't need to structure your content, so you don't need to organize it, all that kind of stuff?
So hold on, are you saying terms to teams, or in respect to the code? Because
In terms of the teams, you're trying to influence them to, not create these big monolithic documents that organizing them and structuring them will help people find content within them. And being at Google is like, people just need to search for it and they'll find it. So why do you need to do all this extra work to it?
that's funny. No, we didn't actually see a lot of that. In fact, I find it funny that I know other Googles would probably say the same thing. Obviously, Google is a well-known search company, and search is still its main thing. But our internal search, for example, for many, many years was rather terrible, if you can believe it. It's because our system is built for scale. It's built for searching billions of things and finding relevance based on almost like machine learning in some respect. If you're searching a corpus that's only like 1,000 or 10,000 documents, it's actually only as good as the keywords you put in, which is kind of funny. And search itself is like, no, I think because engineers are, it's not like they go to Google and they completely forget, how they did things before. There are useful things such as writing design documentation, going through those processes, that engineers do realize the value of conceptual documentation, for example, because they've always needed to turn to them at some point or another. So I didn't find that as much as at all. There is a bias towards search, of course, in the company itself, but that diminishes every year as we go into different things.
Same question. We've been talking about the need for navigation and search in our own documentation. So actually that was interesting to hear about. We have a question from Dave also, if you just want to jump in, Dave.
Sure. Oh, is it the one with software engineering practices do you think are inappropriate for small startups?
Something about having links.
Let me see.
To other parts of the tour. If you have, you go ahead.
Yeah, if Dave's here, or I'll just jump in. I mean, this is more like a pet peeve of mine. So I don't know what other writers think. Remember that I'm talking to other writers here, so this is just my opinion. I tend to write tutorials very linearly. I will have links, but I view links in some ways like footnotes. When I'm reading a book, and if I'm reading, I read a lot of history. There are a lot of footnotes in there, and I will occasionally go down and read the footnote. But if I'm really engrossed in it, I should not need to read the footnote. And I view a tutorial the same way regarding links. There might be links for more information, for other stuff, but those should always be asides. And in specific, specifically, I don't want people to need to jump ahead and then jump back, or to jump to a different page and then jump back. As I think a lot of people know, once you lose the page view, it's harder to get it back. So that does mean I tend to write tutorials pretty sparsely compared to other folks, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of my least favorite getting started guides was the one, without naming anything, was the one where they're all links out to different documents to do this thing and then do this thing. And then when you open them, some of them open in a new tab and some of them open in the same tab. Yeah. And then you inevitably get lost. When I want to go back to the original list, wait, was that back, or was that on a different tab, or where was I? And it's hard to finish that process. That was an interesting and painful learning experience.
I think part of this bias is also my bias against the wiki model that we originally had, because it had a lot of that. People were like crowdsourcing stuff. And I'm still relatively suspect of, like, for example, open source crowdsourcing of documentation. It can work, but without a proper organization for people to put things in the right pigeonholes, I think it's just a disaster waiting to happen. I do, And part of it is also I'm just a control freak. If I'm writing a tutorial, I want to own it from beginning to end because I don't want to depend on something that might break or might go away or might get deleted or become obsolete. Even if I do own those documents, sometimes those documents get moved or some teams take them over. I just had to write a whole bunch of documentation for Google just recently on how to set up their development environments to work from home. And all this information is available in like 20 different pages on 20 different projects. But I basically just wrote a linear tutorial that did not need people to go anywhere else. And I still got some resistance for that because they thought, oh, you're duplicating stuff. And I'm like, and I did admit that. I was like, I don't like duplicating material, but there's nothing here. I don't have ownership of these 20 different docs, and I don't like pointing 20 different places. So I'd rather just own this and we'll fix it up later. And that's kind of what we've done.
Does documentation require somebody at the top who's a control freak who organizes everything and it all has to fit in that framework? As I'm saying, as opposed to the wiki publicly or crowdsourced model, is that like what works? Having one person in charge of the architecture?
I don't know. I think maybe. I mean, I view, at Google, we have owners files. There are capital owners. I think I mentioned it in the book. Mm-hmm. And those are a hierarchy, a file structure that goes all the way up to the top. Mm-hmm. And for the documentation that I own developer guides. And there's a hierarchy that goes up to the top, and I'm an owner of that. So what that means is that no one can change that directory structure without me knowing about it. And that's important. Because occasionally I get some people may think something that's entirely valid, but change for the sake of change is usually not good. Consistency is generally a good philosophy. It's something that I think we mentioned in the style guides chapter we have. There are times when Google just makes decisions, not because one way or another is better, but just because we need to make a decision. The classic one is 80 columns versus 100 columns. Which do you prefer? And people will fight this holy war to the death. And we made the rule of 80 columns, and people will gripe about it. But we basically say, we're not saying this is better, but this is all our code is like this right now. And we're just going to run with it.
You have to choose something.
Yeah.
Do we have some more questions from people? Does anyone else have a question? I'll just wait.
Well, I'd like to know, I guess, is there something publicly available that's anything like G3 Doc?
No, not that I know of, but I completely acknowledge that I live in the Google bubble and I don't venture outside and look at stuff. I do a bunch of open source stuff. I work on AbCell, which is our open source code. We have thought about open sourcing G3 Doc itself, but I'm not sure where that stands. The problem is it needs to be built into whatever different version control system you have. So what I would like us to do, for example, is to kind of like, and I can probably talk to Rihanna about this, is to kind of come up with a spec for what we think a documentation and code system should cover. And then like graft one of those onto like GitHub, for example, or Garrett in this case. But no, I don't think there's anything that's exactly that. I'm kind of annoyed that GitHub is probably the closest because native Markdown you can actually get native Markdown within the code, but it's not quite the same.
No, I work for a small startup that does a lot of Python coding, and we use Sphinx to generate some documentation automatically, and there are ways you can add to it with the RST files or Markdown files. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of clunky, and just wish there were something a little smoother, and G3 Doc sounds smoother.
Yeah, no, I know. I feel your pain because I've done something similar. Was it C++ has? I can't remember the name of it right now. It fails me, but I banged my head against it. Java has Java Doc, of course. A lot of these generation platforms. But Yeah, generated docs are always a bit of, they work well in Python and Java, although as you know, they're a bit clunky. In C++, they don't even work at all. It's just almost impossible because there's no introspection of the code in C++. And it's very hard to generate stuff without introspection.
I've got a question for you. A lot of the comments you made where you're talking about just process and templates and those things seem to reflect a pretty clear and deep understanding of the whole documentation lifecycle. Is that something that you find yourself kind of evangelizing to the engineers at Google about kind of the whole life cycle of documentation, not just writing it, but then what you need to do to maintain it and update it and version it and all the things you're talking about?
Oh yeah, and I don't just talk about documentation in that respect. I evangelize just generally on the maintenance, especially to newer engineers or non-expert engineers. Is that maintenance of both the documentation and the code is something you almost always need to invest more time in. And in specific for documentation, that it's almost better for a document not to exist than for it to be fraught with error. We do something in G3Doc, which I think other people have started to do. We've introduced stuff like freshness states, which basically you put in a freshness state and you have something in your metadata that says it should be reviewed every 3 months or 6 months. And if it doesn't, the engineer gets an email. A lot of engineers don't like that, of course, but it turns out to be pretty good to remind them to check whether this is actually up to date. It only takes a little bit. But those sort of little maintenance hooks are important. The other thing that's a good maintenance hook is just a good, clear organization. If you have a bunch of different markdown files in one directory and there's no sitemap and they're all just kind of there, some of them inevitably are going to get out of date. But if you put them in a table of contents and you lay it out and you make sure that every document someone can log a bug directly from the document, which we do at Google, that's hugely important because someone's going to hit that doc based on navigation and they're going to file a bug. Now, when I first joined the C++ team, all of the C++ docs were separate documents. And we had something called the C++ style guide, which we do publish externally. Some people hate it, some people love it, but it was our go-to C++ document. Every Google engineer knew that doc. But once I integrated that into a guide, the readership for every other associated document went up about 700% in 1 month. Just because people now saw, oh, there's this, there's that, there's this. So those are the things I do tell people about the organization, and making sure that you maintain documentation is important.
And on the tools question that you had in terms of looking for a better tool that we were just talking about, we have a team of people at Google working with Google on the Angular documentation. And that system actually is an Angular app.
Yeah.
So we're using Angular to document Angular, and it's actually the documentation app is part of the build. So,
yeah, that's kind of like the holy grail. Obviously, it's always specific to each language. One thing I was involved in the past on something similar at Google. It never went anywhere. We didn't get enough engineers. This was before G3Doc. Most of the things that we thought about eventually became part of G3Doc. But one thing I wanted to have, for example, is I wanted each document that depended on code to somehow have an ID related to that code. And when that code changed, the document owner would get an email saying, hey, that code that you depended on got changed. It's enormously difficult to do that because it's free text and stuff like that, and there's a lot of stuff. It was strictly possible though. And I still think something like that would be useful. That was the point I brought up about using examples to see documentation. That would have made it super easy. You could basically just have includes to examples. And once those things changed, the document, you'd get and it would be a cascading effect. If that document included another document, it would keep on going up, and someone would you would basically be triggering an event in the DOM, so to speak. And we might get stuff like that in the near future. Who knows? I do see, at least at Google, engineers taking documentation much more seriously now than they were a decade ago. Oh, and Doxy is great too. Lisa Carey, who I mentioned as one of my editors, she worked on Doxy. Hi, Jared.
Yeah, I was just going to plug Doxy too, since
Okay.
Kubernetes. So, yeah. It's not quite G3Doc, but it does integrate with GitHub,
Yep.
and it does allow you to have doc versioning and easily get analytics and feedback. So there are many others like it, but it's pretty good. It's what a lot of Google sites use.
Yep. Yeah, but you might be able to offer better advice on G3Doc like stuff. What I usually tell engineers to do is to do the simplest GitHub pages, sort of. Here's your docs directory and just publish it on GitHub, and it shouldn't be that complex.
Yeah, I mean GitHub's features are solid. So using GitHub with its built-in liquid templates is a great starting point. Doxy is good if you have more than, I would say, 20 pages of content, and you're looking for a site that is growing, that's going to scale, that you want to maintain over the long term. But read the docs is also excellent, especially if you're using Sphinx and Python. So there's definitely a couple options out there, but I use Doxy for a lot of sites that I've built, and I've been pretty happy with it. Yeah.
We had a talk on Doxy a few years ago, I think it was. I think it was Write the Docs. It might have been STC San Francisco. I don't remember now. But it was a talk in San Francisco by Anne, what's her name? The person who developed Doxy. I forgot her last name.
Anne Farmer?
I forget.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I do know that Doxy has been in various. It was like a pre-release for a while. It was public, but it wasn't announced. But yeah, 2-3 sounds about right.
Mm-hmm.
But I do seriously wish that there was like a standard way to document code within the code. We don't yet have that. We have that at Google, but we don't yet have that externally, as far as I know.
Is there a standard for that? Is there sort of a checklist or a rule of thumb?
Well, I mean, it's done through the G3Doc platform.
Okay.
Anyone who creates a project gets a 3Doc directory. So that almost by itself, that kind of is like, hey, you should be looking at this, you know.
Right.
One other thing that I worked on at Google in my career is we had something called the Google Developer Handbook at one time, which was wiki-based, but it was permissioned wiki-based, so it was kind of like halfway between. But it was basically one pagers on each product. And what we ended up doing is I ended up converting most of those to Markdown and putting those into G3Doc directories for the projects as overview files, because that's pretty much what they were. And just that process itself helped to seed the documentation sets, because they would say, oh, here's an overview. And someone would invariably write a bug and they're like, how do I use this? Can someone write a tutorial? And I would send it off to the engineers and they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe we should do that. You can do these psychological tricks with engineers to get them the right documentation.
How do you use customer feedback at Google? I imagine that you're able to collect plenty of it. I'm wondering how that plays into the process.
Yeah, I probably didn't talk about that as much. I'm more angled towards the programming bent here. We have various ways to get feedback on our documentation. but I try to steer everyone to one thing because having multiple things tends to lead to problems. And I usually steer people to filing documentation bugs. That's not the best mechanism, I gotta say, because the way that Google handles bugs is probably no better than anybody else how they handle bugs. I don't think anyone has the holy grail on how software engineers handle bugs in general. But I do like, for example, when we publish something in G3Doc or even on any of my docs, I will have the metadata, the bug component that this document is associated with, and whenever and that automatically gets, if you see a problem, click that button and we will generate a documentation bug associated with it. And then I'll get that email, and then I'll triage it just like I will, that's why I keep on hammering to engineers that documentation is like code. You triage your documentation bugs. I triage them like once a week usually. And I'll go through and I'll say, like, oh, this one's important, stuff like that. There are other things that are built in, such as like there's widgets for comments in line, stuff like that. I tend to not like those because that tends to distribute the feedback in multiple places. And you have to be on top of that, and then maybe another thing. But I certainly see if people can maintain those different mechanisms, that's fine with me. I would say if you're going to do that, try to come up with one feedback loop, because otherwise it's kind of like unit testing. If you make these things too difficult, people are just going to stop doing it. So there's some psychology there. Simplify as much as possible, but no further.
Do we have some more questions?
Yeah, I'm looking through the past. Someone asked, what software engineering practices do we think are inappropriate for small startups in general? I mean, this goes back to the whole time, scale, cost mechanism of evaluating things. If you're a startup, if your company might not last 2 years, so you probably don't care about something that lasts 2 years. I think Titus wrote something in the beginning of the chapter of like for example, unit tests start to have value within hours. If you write a unit test, it might take you a while, but you're iterating. If you do test-driven development, you're iterating on your API, and those tests are starting to have value almost immediately. Something like a robust continuous integration system, though, might not make sense for a startup. And certainly something like release management. Release management may be someone just deploying an NPM or some executable and pushing it out there manually. But obviously, as you scale, you're going to have to revisit those things. I think that's okay. It's okay to be burdened by success. It's okay to write code that you didn't expect to last for 6 months and then go, oh, now I got to refactor this because someone gave me another $10 million. And I'm like, well, that's great. If only we all had that worry.
Well, we found that we had to get away from a monorepo, whereas Google can afford the tools to work with a monorepo and have billions of lines of code, but for a small startup, the monorepo is just an anchor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I don't know if that's discussed directly in the chapter, but we fully recognize that the monorepo is unique to Google. I think Bloomberg has something similar, and they're a very large C++ code base, but other than that, that's not the case. But don't think that the point is that you need to have a monorepo. What you really need to have is a single source for every module or dependency within your code development chain. That's the more difficult part. And if you start doing branch management and doing integration branches, that's where you can get into trouble. It's trying to have clear delineations between, I'm sure Microsoft, for example, I'm sure the Office team and the operating system team may not talk. I don't know, I heard stories in the past. They might have separate repos, but that's okay as long as they know where their integrations are and they make sure not to cross those boundaries. Single sourcing is the key thing that I would say. And that goes for documentation, by the way. Single sourcing is incredibly important for documentation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. No, I'm just reading what John had said about Yahoo. Yeah, I certainly think 15 to 15,000. Yeah, well, that's even lower. I think I estimated the number of technical writers at Google and in engineering, just in engineering, and it was about 1 in every 100 to 150 when I joined, and it's still about 1 to every 150. And that's across all technical writing families, though, in engineering. That's developer docs, internal docs, some people who do product marketing, but they do it within an engineering context. So one thing I usually, and I think I mentioned this in the chapter.
Your sound is breaking up, Tom.
Oh, is my sound breaking up?
Yeah, maybe you have a loose connection or something.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
I'm hearing it okay.
Okay.
Oh.
Oh, so
Might-
yeah. Well, I'll just continue and let me know if I'm breaking up. But one thing that one thing that I would say to advice to technical writers is to not, don't be confrontational with engineering teams. You need their goodwill, but stand your ground on what you think is worth standing your ground. Whenever I deal whenever I come to a new team, some engineering teams are like, hey, this is great, and they know exactly what they need, and I work great with them. And some engineering teams are kind of like, here, can you review this doc, or can you do this, or they treat you like a support person. I tend not to work that well with the latter type, and I go like, there are more important things for me to do than to do that. I need to fix your API documentation, for example. So I would encourage technical writers to kind of focus on that because there's not that many of us, and product teams might selfishly just want to use you for their own team rather than your customer base, which is probably the more important part. Whoever reads their developer documentation, for example.
I think we got through everything that was in the queue there.
Yeah.
Now I'm wondering if anybody has a lingering question that they're just gathering up their gumption to jump in and ask a question before we wrap things up.
I mean, I have a question.
Yes.
This is self-interested because I'm talking to writers. I wrote the documentation chapter, and if I know anything about technical writers, because I am one, I know that no two technical writers would agree on the content of that documentation chapter. So I'm kind of curious what people think and disagree with, or even might hate about that chapter, for example.
Well, I thought one particular thing was controversial, potentially controversial. You wrote, I'm glad you asked. You wrote, software engineers will always need to write most of the documentation themselves. Yeah. I don't know if everyone would agree with that, because there are those. I've heard it said recently that that engineers can't write. That the trouble is that engineers can't write.
Oh, there definitely is that case. So yeah. here's my reasoning for that. One is, first of all, I think I make it clear that I expand what I mean by documentation. I'm including code commenting, for example. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's actually, if you're code generating, if you're using Sphinx, in C++, if I have header files are primary means, they're the primary reference documentation. So engineers are almost always the first person to write those. I do clean those up, but not every technical writer has that sort of experience or knowledge in the code base. And they shouldn't. There's just not enough of us. There's 1 out of 100 at best. 1 out of 1,000 maybe at Yahoo. So the secondary reason I mentioned that is not necessarily to be controversial, but to actually speak to engineers and to say, like, No, documentation is part of your job. Because I think in the past they haven't thought it's part of their job. I think most engineers freely admit they hate writing documentation. They always complain about the quality of documentation. And like a quote that I wanted to put in, I don't think I put it in there, was every person hates Congress but loves their congressperson, or something along those lines. And it's sort of like it's sort of like the way that people, engineers, think about documentation. It's like, oh, this documentation is terrible, but I don't want to write documentation. You know, and I kind of wanted to bridge that as that's why I put that in there. So maybe it's a bit more forceful than it should be to writers, because I don't want to take away what writers do. What I want to do is free writers to work on the stuff that really matters. Because I've been assigned drudge support jobs, probably like everybody else. I join a team and they're like, hey, this is the most important thing. And I'm like, is it really the most important thing? And over time, people figure out that, no, this isn't the most important thing. And that most recent insight that I mentioned at the very beginning, I think, of the talk here, was that engineers are usually pretty good at telling themselves stuff, like their own team. But they're not very good at crossing that line and going out to an API or going to the external world, God forbid, and telling those people how to use their products. And there they like throw up their hands and go like, oh my God, I can't do this. And that's where I think technical writers have the most bang for the buck.
That's great.
And I think someone asked if the book is available. Yes, it's available. It's on store shelves, whenever stores. So there is an electronic version available that's like $30. I think the book itself is probably only about 40 right now, and it's on Amazon. I'm a person who likes a physical copy, but we are going to publish this with a Creative Commons license in probably about 4 months. So it will be freely available. Me, Titus, and Hiram, we want to get this into academics. We want to get this into like seniors at software schools, because we don't think we think these students are taught the solo hero programmer role, and they're not taught how to work with a team and what engineering means. So we kind of want to give, and it might make a good, during this COVID time, you know, a lot of students might be sitting at home. It might be a good thing to give them to think about before they join work.
I just posted the link to the book.
Oh yeah, and I guess June asked,
if anyone wants to jump right there.
Was your book intended for all Google developers or a particular segment? We tried to make it intended for all developers, and I can't say that we always succeed, because we have something called Google 3, which is what almost all of my experience has been in. There are other code bases at Google. Even at Google, there's not one monorepo, believe it or not. We have, for example, we have Android, we have YouTube is in Google 3 now. We have all of the stuff that's with the experimental projects that are spun out of Alphabet in different code bases. Waymo, for example. A lot of those folks did contribute, and certainly gave us, we tried specifically to get people outside of Google 3 to look at our book and say, hey, is this generally applicable to software engineering? And we did to get that feedback. But I mean, I'm not sure that we got 100% of the way there. But I would say that in general, we tried to make it generally applicable to engineering audiences. Thanks, June.
All right, are there any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So in this day and age where it seems that, well, I guess I made an assumption that your book is hard copy, but maybe my first question would be, is this a hard copy? And I'm sorry, I'm going to ask more than one question. I'm wondering what kind of reaction or feedback that you've been getting so far. But I'm just wondering regarding the format of the book, where there seems to be all these different models of writing books, and so I'm going to stop.
Sure. Yeah. No. It's available hard copy. It's an O'Reilly imprint, and O'Reilly also automatically publishes everything they do electronically on Safari as well. So it is available there as an electronic book, and that's what we're pushing to. I mean, we're sending this book out, for example, to a lot of our Nooglers to have them read as they join. I'm old school. I like a physical book in my hand, so that's. I want to someday go to a bookstore when those open and actually take a picture of one on the shelf somewhere. But as far as feedback goes, yeah, we've gotten pretty good feedback, and most people have seemed to like it. One thing we've gotten like a average rating of like 4.1 from different software engineers. So that's good. I mean, I think the preface is available online. If you're thinking about actually getting the book, read the preface on O'Reilly's site. It'll give you kind of an idea of what we intend to cover, and see if that works. But some engineers have, there have been some people that are like, oh, this is Google. What do they have to teach me? And I caution folks on that. I don't want us to think that we're telling other people what to do, or we're on some cloud or something. We're just a successful engineering company. We made a heck of a lot of mistakes, and if you actually read the book, you will see some of those mistakes in there. I think most of those mistakes are not unique to Google. They are pretty common in software engineering. But the one thing Google has is longevity. It has been around for now 22 years, which I can't believe. So there are some lessons that I think we can offer for that. But we'd welcome feedback. I know that one person tweeted that they actually quit their job because they read our book, which is kind of funny. Yeah, the person wrote, "We have such terrible software practices, and I finally confirmed that. So I quit my job, and I'm going to try to find another." And we're like, "Whoa, maybe you don't want to quit your job right now."
Oh,
So I have a related question to something you just said. I'm curious. So maybe the older engineers are still using hard copy books, but what about the younger engineers? There definitely is a place for, well, I agree with you. I find it a lot easier, quicker to use hard copy, but maybe not always. But I'm just wondering if the younger engineers are also using hard copy. If maybe it's not as age related as maybe we think. I don't know.
I actually don't know the answer to that question. I think it may not be as age related as you know, because I mean, even at my age, I'm somewhat of an outlier in liking a physical book. Any of my friends who have moved me, I have received 2 Kindles in my life from friends that have helped me move all my books in the past, and they're like, "Please get on a Kindle so that I don't have to do this again." And they're my age, so I'm not sure. We do have an electronic copy that we do give to engineers joining Google, and most of those are young. And personally, what I'm doing is I'm actually, the reason that we got permission to do this in the first place, because it doesn't make Google any money. We do want to affect software engineering. But one thing that we did is we actually wrote down all of these practices that I'm pulling back and publishing internally through Markdown in G3 Doc in a variety of different places for engineers to benefit from. And basically, we consider this a great con. I conned 30 engineers into writing documentation that I wanted them to write, and we gave them the book as a side benefit.
well, you can see if by behind me that I like hardcover books, but I'm reading this one online.
That's fine. And I am on Twitter, so if people want to tweet questions or something like that, it's just my last name. I don't have much there, but feel free to.
So this is Susan again. I'm wondering if what have you learned through this process aside from the writing of a book? But what have you learned?
Well, I mean, I learned most of the material that I was not familiar with. One thing I learned, which I don't want this to sound conceited, but was that the ideas that I had about documentation actually work, because I ended up using many of those in the production of the book. For example, one thing I set up was a review system. And personally, what I've always done with reviews is, and this is not for small reviews, this is for large reviews at Google, is I've usually wanted to get 3 different perspectives on any large documentation set. One is for accuracy, one is editorial, and one is for audience. So I would usually send out a documentation, for example, to another writer to have them evaluate it, to an engineer to evaluate for accuracy. And then like when a new engineer joined that team, I would say, hey, can you look at this and tell me whether it works? Because all 3 of those things end up like helping the documentation set. And I did the same thing with this book. Each of the chapters, I got a bunch of reviewers and I asked them, hey, what are you expert in? And then I would specifically assign them chapters that they were not expert in. And that helped out tremendously because they were like, hey, I don't know anything about build systems. And I would be, great, you don't know anything about build systems, so let me know what you take away from this chapter. And that worked out tremendously. That was actually some of the best feedback we got was from those audience reviewers, which I find interesting.
How about communicating with engineers, with other engineers? Do you have any insight that would be helpful?
Oh, well, sure, but it's not really related to the book. So this is more like I've been, this isn't my first rodeo. So I think there are different engineering teams and different ways to interact with engineers. I'm a programmer by trade, but most engineers don't assume that, and they don't, and some of them probably have a bias against technical writers, dare I say. So when I would join a team, they might not necessarily be the most collaborative. And there's a story that I wanted to put in the book, and this is the story, but it was just anecdotal. This was probably my first month at Google. I joined a new team, which was Google Checkout at the time. It was a product that allowed you to buy stuff online, like a PayPal system. Except we didn't want to compete with PayPal at the time. But I joined this team and I started attending these weekly meetings, team meetings. And I remember the first meeting, some engineer was drawing something on the board, and I was like, I wasn't getting it, and I didn't feel like, okay, I don't know what's going on. I'll go look and read it about it later. I would go back and not understand what the heck it was. This happened like maybe the second week. And then by the third week, so, same kind of thing would happen. And someone would go, any questions? And I would raise my hand and I would go like, hey, I'm just a technical writer, but I don't understand what's going on over there in step 4. And then immediately 2 engineers would go, hey, yeah, me too. I don't understand what's going on there either. Another engineer would say, yeah, could you explain that more? So I would say is probably have a bit more confidence. Let the engineers know that you're there to ask questions, and that's your job. And try to do that in the most civil way possible. It's sometimes hard. I think everyone here has probably their own war stories. But that's how I view my job, is to ask questions. And sometimes that doesn't mean asking every question that's on my mind at the time. Like, for example, if I'm researching an API, the first thing I do is I go through it from top to bottom and I compile a list of questions. And I do not send those questions out until I'm done. Because by the time I'm done reading the API, I will have answered half of my own questions. And that's usually a good thing.
Um, I don't have a question, but I missed the first part because the internet connection went. But I want to congratulate you, and it's an awesome thing. You make all the tech writers. You raised all our status. Google, one of the most, I mean, the topmost company in the world, and you and a tech writer has written a book on software engineering. That's awesome. To me, that raises the bar for us all writers. I mean, I know you're struggling with all, like everybody else, like fighting with the engineers and getting the respect to what you are. You probably know a lot more software engineering than some of the junior engineers over there, but they assume automatically that you're a technical writer. Okay, you may not know what they're doing, but the fact that Google, I mean, you did this for Google. I mean, I am so, I can't tell you, hands down. I mean, thank you for doing this for all of us writers.
But thanks a lot. That makes me feel pretty good. So thank you for that. But yeah, no, I understand. I have your job, so it's not. I've gone through what you all have gone through.
Well, I can say, having read about halfway through this book, that it's a very fine book and you should all read it.
Thanks. I don't even have to sell it.
I probably will buy copies and present it to my engineering VPs or executive VPs and say that, okay, this is what a writer can do. This is what
Yeah.
writers are about.
I hope that the book continues to be useful. I think you all have seen you've all seen computer books in the past. It would pain me to see it. We don't have borders anymore, but to see in the remainder section of software from 2020 that no one reads anymore. I tried not to put in things that would get dated that way. The practices I pointed out, I hope were a bit more long-lived than that, but you never know. But thank you. Okay, Clarence, what do you think?
I'm just sort of letting it hang because then if I start talking, somebody might have a question.
That's fine.
But if that wraps it up, I think Claire might have some final announcements. Do we have anything we have to end with?
Only opening it up for job openings.
Yes.
I'm going to stop the recording now then. Thank you so much for a great presentation, Tom. That was awesome.
Thanks. I